you know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, you know, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. You know, we pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown, you know. I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. You know, we would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities. See what was going on, you know? Yeah, now, whatever that comes from, I don't know. But it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life. So that was an escape, definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Happy Halloween, Cuttlefish! Woohoo! Yay! Welcome to Season 3, Episode 8 of Floaties for Krakens. I can't believe it. Happy Halloween. The best holiday on the universe, in the universe, on the planet. Oh my god, I can't believe we're already here. I can't believe it's the end of October. What is going on? Oh my gosh, this world flies by too fast, but please make sure to celebrate today. What a beautiful, fun day to get scared and to have fun with friends and family and loved ones. So, yeah, welcome. And thank you for tuning in today, of all days, to our show. I feel like it's a well-known holiday among us here at the Floaties family. So thanks for joining us and celebrating with us today. Today we have an incredibly special episode for you all, and I am so lucky to have been able to create this super special Halloween treat for you all. A few months ago, I was in contact with the lovely Kristy P. Kulski, who is an immensely talented Korean-American writer and just a powerhouse of an artist. She had mentioned an anthology that she was working on that is on the horizon, and she came up with the amazing idea of hosting a few different specials to promote not only the amazing piece of work, but the brilliant authors behind it. In May of 2025, Kristy's anthology titled Silk and Sinew, a collection of folk horror from the Asian Diaspora, will premiere for the world to see. With a special thanks to Bad Hand Books, thank you Bad Hand Books, Silk and Sinew will tease forth folk horror rooted in the experience of the Asian Diaspora. From lengths of muscle and vein, ground bones, endless ropes of sinew, it is with our bodies folk horror is woven. The anthology will include stories, poetry, and essays on history and folklore. What an amazing piece of work, right? Aren't you all so excited for it to premiere? Oh, me too, me too, me too. So for today's special Halloween episode, I introduce to you 4 stunning authors that will be featured in this very collection. Raina Mason, she, her, Audrey Zhao, she, her, Kanishk Tantia, he, him, and Sung Kim, he, they. All of their bios, by the way, which are immaculate, will be in the description box below. And of course, thanks to Kristy's masterful brain, this specific episode explores identity in the world of Asian folk monsters and their ties to us as people. Kristy, Sung, Audrey, Kanishk, Raina, thank you all so much for the brilliant work that you create and for being kind enough to speak with me on the show. I am just so excited for the world to see your collection, and I'm selfishly excited to read it. I'm just so thankful that you each carve such safe spaces for us monsters seeking peace. Just a quick content warning for this episode. In the following interview, there will be mentions and discussions of bullying, racism, mental health difficulties, and generational trauma. take the time you need to take care of yourselves. Well, happy Halloween, spooky kids. Grab some candy, put on your best Halloween costume, and snuggle up to your phone, computer, or however you listen to us. Ladies and cuttlefish, let me introduce to you Asian Identity for Folk Monsters, a Silk and Sinew special. Well, hello everybody. Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Floaties show. Yay! Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, I'm thrilled. I'm so excited. I'm just excited to have this many wonderful people in one room at one time. I think we're gonna have some amazing conversations today. So I'm pumped. I'm pumped. But before we get to what the big project that all of you all have been working on, will be working on, can we go down the line and hear a little bit about who you are and what you do in the world of the spooky? Does that sound good?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, Kanish, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. I'm Kanish. You can find some of my writing and some of my words in various magazines. I think Apex Magazine, Flame Tree, a few others. But as for me, I'm an immigrant from India. I was born there. I grew up there, and I came to the U.S. mainly for my undergraduate degree in computer science and math. I currently live in San Diego. My writing is, I would say, fairly eclectic and not actually that centered on what I would think of as traditional horror. I write much more firmly in sort of like fantasy and science fiction. So, and I know that the other people on the podcast today actually write significantly more horror than I do. So I'm kind of like the baby of the group here. I feel like I'm an intruder coming in from the outside, being like, I wrote one horror story, and here I am on a podcast today.
No.
Yeah, that's me. Oh, you can find my website, kanishkt.com.
Yes.
Humble shout out for myself.
No, do it, please. And I promise. I'll be asking you all this at the end of the episode, but we're going to link everything that you all would like us to link in our description box. So don't worry, please brag about yourselves. You all are awesome, so it's important. Awesome. Well, Raina, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Rena Mason. I am an American horror, mostly known for horror, but also dark speculative fiction. So Kanish, I think that's where what you're talking about is like dark spec fic, where you kind of go all over and blend them a little bit. And I've been writing for a while now. I've won a couple of Bram Stoker awards for my horror.
Yes.
And I am still writing it, and that's basically me. And if you're going to give all the rest of the information later, I'll just go on to the next.
That's so amazing.
And
Gosh, what it must be like to win a Bram Stoker award and win 2. That's so awesome. Congratulations. That's great.
Thanks.
Audrey, how about yourself?
Yes, for sure. So hi, I'm Audrey Zoe. I'm a Chinese American spec fic writer in North Carolina. Kanish, I think I'm like more of a baby than you when it comes to the horror area. This was like my second acceptance ever. So my other stories, one of them has been published since then, but my first one was in Strange Horizons, and I have a Flash in Orion's Belt. But yes, I'm currently finishing my final year of undergrad for computer science and statistics. But I think fiction is definitely where my love lies. But yeah, super excited to like meet more writers and get more involved in the community.
That's so awesome. All of y'all are so brilliant. This is great. I love it. Last but certainly not least, Sung.
Hi, I'm Sung Kim. I'm a librarian and a writer, and I live near Chicago. And I mostly write science fiction and fantasy, but also I love horror, like horror movies, horror games. And this is like one of the first horror stories that I think I've like finished. So
yeah. That's amazing. See, each of you, I think, are going to have a lot of fun over this next hour and a half because I think each of you mentioned, right, this kind of, I don't know, intersection or weaving of like these different genres and these different backgrounds to create these stories, right? And I think that's what we love to explore on our Floaties show, right? Is what really is the definition of these words? Is there a definition of something like horror, for example, right? Or a scary story, right? Is there one way to do that? And that's why I'm really, really thrilled to hear each of your different perspectives and your different backgrounds and how they mesh for you. So you all are in a great place, and I'm so excited to pick your brains. It's going to be so much fun. Cool. Well, big question for each of you. How did writing kind of come into your world before we get into, I guess, the genres of them? But what made you interested about becoming a writer? And anyone can go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Since mine's probably the most non-traditional. When I was younger, I did not start writing until later on in life, until I want to say my late 30s, so I'm probably the oldest one in this group. Um, and it was after a vacation of reading books that I thought were boring. They were
Yeah.
like they were domestic books, about relationships and whatnot. And I felt like I want something exciting. Like if you wanted to know if you were in a relationship and it was going to work out, throw in a monster. And if you both escape, if you both survive it, if you work together, then that's a good sign that you're probably, either it's going to make you or break you, right? And
Yeah.
so that's when I decided I want to write that book. So that's when I started writing, was late in my 30s. And I was really naive then. I thought, okay, I'm gonna write this book. I'm gonna get it published in a year, and this is how things are gonna roll. And then if I'm done, I'll see if I want to keep doing it. And it kind of exploded into a well. It actually, I was very lucky. It actually only took me 3 years before my first piece was published,
It's amazing.
and I got an acceptance for my novel. And I have debated over the years whether or not I wanted to stop, but I think once I opened that door, it's hard now to, and I've talked about this before. It's where I have characters that talk to me in my
Mm.
head, and they tell me their stories, and I feel sometimes, and a lot of people have said this, like a translator. I'm just transcribing what it is they're telling me to transcribe. And as long
Yeah.
as they keep bugging me, I have to get their stories out of my head. And once I do get those stories down, I notice the characters like dissipate unless they have, another story to tell. But
Yeah.
that's what got me started writing, compared to a lot of people. I have heard that it's different.
That's incredible. I love that you said, like I could write
Mhm.
better than this. Like I read this story. I could do a little bit better. You're absolutely correct.
I
And
just wanted that little bit of, I guess because I grew up liking horror and being such a fan of horror, that I just wanted a little bit of horror in those
yeah.
stories just to make them more exciting, because they were for me, they were quite boring.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you elaborate on what you mean by boring? Because I love that. I think we can all relate in a way, but I'm curious what you meant.
They're really slow. And
Yeah.
because I think I had been recommended those books by some friends, and maybe it was friends who were like in bad relationships, I don't know, or were working through
Yeah.
something, which I
Yeah.
wasn't at the time. I was doing just fine. So I think it was just my choice of books. Now that I know more, I know what to choose. If I'm going on vacation, I know what books that I want to read now.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I just went off of recommendations from friends, and that's what I
Yeah.
mean by boring.
I love it. I love it. No, that's fantastic. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to talk to you more about your specific story in this anthology. But also, Kanish, don't worry about it. I know you said your internet died and you disappeared for 5 seconds. That is okay. You did the right thing. If that happens to anybody, just everybody else will stay in the room, keep going, and you can just bounce right back. No big deal at all. Just so you know.
Awesome. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Technology's weird. You're totally fine. Um, Wonderful. Well, Sung, same question. How did writing kind of come into your world?
Um, for me, it was maybe similar in the fact that I had a powerful impulse to change the way a story was going, but it was Naruto in like 2007. So
Oh my gosh, no way.
so I started with like writing fan fiction, and I was also on like Fiction Press and like kind of like online stories, and I did NaNoWriMo RIP a couple of times in high school.
Wow.
Um, and then in 2019, I got into writing short stories, and I've kind of done it as a hobby ever since.
Wow, that's so awesome. I think
Yeah,
I
that's great.
love that you mentioned this, like this online platform that a lot of us grew up with exploring writing and short story and fiction. And I love that that sparked your voice in that world too. I think that's great. And how did you know that like you wanted to, I don't know, write fiction, right? Like that was the genre that you really like to do.
Good question. I think, well, when I started in 2019, it was just kind of like having an idea for a concept of a story, and it was like, oh, that would be cool if that was a thing, which was like, I was reading about Korean mediums and like
Mm,
shamans, and I was like, oh, like what if I combine that with like this other concept and made a story out of it? Yeah, and I
yes.
was reading a lot of short stories at the time. I'm a librarian, so it's like,
It just
yeah, I could do
comes with
that.
the territory. That's so freaking cool. Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, Audrey, how about yourself? How did writing come into the picture?
I think very similar to Sung, I also started out writing fan fiction.
Wow.
I think that same desire to fix stories a little bit when they didn't go the way I wanted them to. But I think it was a great way to like start playing in like other people's worlds and like I guess have
Mhm.
those limitations of trying to like stay in character. Not that all fan fiction has to look like that. That's just how I prefer to write.
Yeah.
But that kind of like sparked my love for storytelling. But it wasn't until like my freshman year of college that I took like a creative writing class for the first time, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm now working on like an honors thesis in fiction writing, which has been really fun. But
Are you
yeah,
really? Can we know what it is?
yes, I don't have like a theme ironed out yet, which might be a problem.
It's okay.
But my first story was like a second chance time loop thing, and then the one that I just finished and I have to workshop tomorrow actually is science fiction, space, weird power dynamics, like military sci-fi. But yeah,
Ooh.
I'm very excited to keep working.
Oh, that sounds amazing. How fun to have an honors thesis explore those themes. That sounds so great. Oh, I love it. We wish you nothing but the best of luck with that too. Because I know,
Thank
I mean, you
you.
all know, you all write, right, all the time. Like, gosh, so much work goes into just a paragraph. So I know that that is going to be amazing. I'm sure it's going to be incredible.
Thank you.
Well, Kanishk, what about you? How did you begin this world of writing?
Um, oh man, I've actually been asked this question a lot recently, and it's always hard to come up with a good answer. Um, I mean, like philosophically, I think I don't know if anyone has read Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, or if everyone has read it. It's one of those books that I feel like is very popular with certain groups of people, which is
Yeah.
mainly writers. But she sort of talks about how like writing is a thing that writers just sometimes do. Like you go around the entire day and you're kind of feeling incomplete, and like there's this haunted, jaded look on your face, and then you write, and you suddenly feel a little bit more alive for a little while. Um, so there's a little bit of that, and there's also this like I want to say this fairly common conception that writers are all to some degree egomaniacs. You're kind of creating your own world and putting your own rules on it, and you're like, I can do this better than anyone else, and I embrace that fully. Like I have a lot of hubris, and a big part of the way that I demonstrate my hubris is like my writing. Like my writing is like almost a statement of like how I think things should be or things could be.
Yes.
I probably first started writing when I was a kid. I wrote short stories and things like that, and I wanted to write a book. Um, now at the ripe old age of like 27, I no longer have the attention span to write a book, so I still write short stories. But yeah, I don't want to say that writing is necessarily something internal or something that only a few people can do, but I think that there are a few kinds of people who are very drawn to the concept of creating a whole world and forcing it to live with certain rules and expectations and controlling the way that like a character or a series of characters behave. And so I would say that there is something sort of fundamentally flawed in many writers, and that comes out in their writing.
And that makes you human. And that's, I don't know, like, see, I love that you all have mentioned this sense of, I wanted to change the story because that's not how I would have seen it, right? Like, I want to put words on paper that matter to me. And I think that specifically helps so many other readers, people that just love to read, finally see themselves represented in so many books that they've maybe never seen themselves reflected in before. You know, it starts with you humans being like, this needs to be flawed. This needs to look like me. I'm flawed. I'm a flawed human being, and this needs to change, right? And I think that creates so many more safe spaces for people that want to see that. They want to see flawed beings. They want to see wild escapism. They want to be, you know, taken away into a book so that they don't have to necessarily deal with reality anymore. And I think that's what's so beautiful about what each of you do. You got to put yourself in it. You have to. It's important. You know, that's great. That's so cool. Well, okay, so each of you have mentioned so many vast genres, so many different genres that you've explored, that maybe you've read and been inspired by, right? Some that you hope to write in the future. But I'm curious, has any of your all's maybe cultural identity, right, or cultural backgrounds influenced your writing? Anybody can go first.
Okay.
So, no, go ahead.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
well,
Song. Go ahead, Song.
a lot of my stories draw from Korean American culture, in some way. So my story Parks Ramen came out of like having family in the restaurant business, and then I have another story about a Korean American shaman, and recently had a Korean folktale retelling published. And I grew up in Michigan, in kind of like rural conservative area, and I didn't grow up around a lot of other Koreans. So part of my writing is like learning new things and kind of being inspired by them. Yeah, and my dad used to tell us Korean folk tales as bedtime stories. So
Can you name a couple?
yeah, so like there's the story of, I think it's Hongbu and Nobu, which is like these brothers who, um, one's like the good brother and one's like the bad brother, and then the other one's like the green frog story, where it's like this mother frog who has these disobedient frog children.
Yes.
So
Gosh, there's something about, I think, BIPOC dads that are just like, you know what? Let me tell you the most wild story ever. Now go to sleep. It's like, okay, thanks, but that's going to stick with me forever. That's so awesome. I love that. I loved that you found that writing was a place for that, you know, to explore that identity. That's great. That's fantastic. Raina, how about yourself?
Oh, for me, it was almost the same. Listening to my mom tell ghost stories. Thailand is a very ghost intensive.
Yes.
As far as like, and a lot of times it's just part of the culture where it's more ancestral. It's just a thing, they're just ghosts, and that's just how it is. It's not. Sometimes they're scary, sometimes they're not. But mostly when I was younger, my mom would tell me the scary ones. I think they're like cautionary tales because,
Mm-hmm.
in Asian culture, a lot of the mythology goes against women. So, if you follow these rules, you won't turn into that bad scary ghost, or you won't run into that bad scary ghost.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the stories that got my brain going and got me curious and into horror. I think at an early age,
Yeah.
I found it exciting.
Definitely. I mean, that's what's so beautiful about like when scary story mixes, I think, with cultural identity, because I mean, I'm a firm believer, right, that monsters across borders, right, across cultures, right, are brilliant mediums for discussing really, really hard things, right, really difficult things, things that are taboo, things that should never be spoken about, right? And that's why horror is a beautiful vessel for that stuff. And as you mentioned, Reina, right, like even cautionary tales, right? As a kid, you're like, all right, I'll go home. I'll be in bed by 8, so nothing bad happens to me. But then you grow up and you're like, oh, there's a lot more to that, and I maybe just never really fully understood. You know, I think that's beautiful. That's awesome. That's great. Audrey or Kanish?
Audrey, do you want to go first?
Yes, I can go first.
Tossing you under the bus
I
there.
know.
All good. I think similarly, growing up, my parents would tell me like stories about like Sun Wukong, and then we would also watch like cartoon versions of like Journey to the West,
Oh my
which
gosh.
I think really like primed me to enjoy like these like fantastical type of stories that like can't happen in our world. But I think a lot of my writing is influenced by like just a desire to see like more Chinese people in stories. I think like
Yes.
all of my characters are Chinese. It's part of just like write what you know. Like I'm Chinese American and I've grown up like that, so that's just what I know.
Yeah.
But also, I think at least in my classes, most of them are very white, so it's just like
Yeah.
kind of nice to just like carve out this space for my stories that's just very Chinese.
Definitely. And that's the beautiful thing. I mean, that is your identity. That is you, right? And I love that you said write what you know, right? That's you at its purest form. That's so I mean, I'm like you, Audrey. I went to a school and university that was predominantly white, and I'm Mexican American. And so I mastered in folklore. And when I was like, oh my God, all of these scary, horror, terrifying Mexican legends and ghosts and things, and everyone's like, what the hell are you talking about? Right, but I was like, no, this is great, right? Like this is magical for me, this is me, and I think that's beautiful that these stories, right, these sci-fi, these ghosts, what have you, carved space for you. They let you have that voice, which is it's brilliant. And I think it's badass too to be like, look at this honors thesis right here, look how many beautiful cultural like traditions and legends and monsters that it touches on. Like that's really cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I mean, I think for my part, my journey is probably a little bit more complex than I heard folklore growing up, and so therefore I include that in my stories. I wrote like a sort of reflective piece for the SFWA called Culture Beyond Set Dressing, where I speak a little bit about sort of the difficulties that I had embracing my own culture, mainly because I had from a very early age the misconception really that to get published in Western fiction, you had to write Western fiction, which was you had to write sort of like the same stories that were part of the predominant culture. You had to sort of write like Asimov, or you had to write in the way that like um, Clark wrote, stuff like that. And so um, I would say it's only over the last like 4 or 5 years that I've really sort of started to embrace Hindu culture and like South Asian mythology and include that in my own stories. Um, what I will say is that I think it's very hard to write stories without having been influenced by some aspect of your culture, right? So my older stories may not have had like explicitly like South Asian legends and monsters and myths in them, but they definitely had like more I would say like almost more melodrama than you would typically find in like a Western story. Sort of the influence of Bollywood, the influence of like Indian culture in general is still pervasive in my work, even if it's like explicitly trying to be coded as like a American fiction or like as British fiction.
Yes.
um so I think that journey for me was like slightly more complex. I did grow up reading like Amar Chitrukatha, which is a comic series on Hindu legends that was very popular in India when I was a child. So I'm very familiar with all of those works. I just didn't include them in any of my stories until fairly recently.
Yeah. That's awesome. I think that's really cool. It's great to have, I think, you experience life and then turn right to these stories. You're like, hey, I remember this. I remember these characters. I remember the melodrama. I remember the intensity. Right? That's cool. I
Yeah.
think that's awesome that they still inspire you. in this way, in a different journey. Everybody has a different journey, sure, but I think that's wonderful. That's so cool. Go for it, Sung.
I have a follow-up question. Do you think like the change of like context changed for you, like when you went abroad to your undergrad, like not being in India anymore?
Yeah. I think that there were a couple of things. When I was in India, I wanted to write something that I didn't think other people were going to write, and
Mhm.
so I wanted to write something that I thought I knew better than the people around me, which at the time was Western fiction. I read a lot of like growing up. I read a lot of like Jeffrey Archer. I read a lot of Neil Gaiman, so that definitely helped. When I came here, I think I realized that I was doing like a pale imitation of a culture that I wasn't like fully a part of when I
Mhm.
wrote quote unquote white fiction, right? So I was basically trying to emulate something that I was only ever going to be like an outsider looking in at. Whereas what I knew intimately really well was South Asian fiction, Hindu mythology, things like that. And so I think I slowly started to realize that what I could really contribute and make a statement about was my personal experiences. So definitely, I think the change of context helped. What also helped, I think, was just kind of like growing and becoming a little bit more mature as a writer. So like once you finish writing a few things, you sort of look back at them after a couple of years and you go, hey, this doesn't really feel like my voice. This feels like not something that is very authentic to the stories that I would like to tell or the stories that like make up who I am. And you start trying to like tinker with that and figure out like what went wrong, what went right. So context for sure. Also just like revising and editing your own work over time. Yeah, things like that.
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you morph, you just morph as a person. And I love that you said editing, right? I think that's what we all do as we grow up just as people, right? And who we are and what matters to us. And then you experience real life stuff and it changes you a lot. And I think that's beautiful that we can see that reflected in your all's writing. That's awesome. That's great. Well, this question is for anybody, but can you all tell us about this project that you are all a part of? What is it? And, what is it all about?
This is where having Kristy would be helpful.
I know, I know. She's here in spirit.
Well, I can say when I was first aware of this project, Kristy had spoke about it in the terms that she wanted to do an anthology that showcased who we are now and Asians who have migrated or are immigrants or no matter where we live, how we bring our diaspora with us, how we bring our culture with us, and how it affects us and how it's changed like the myths that we brought with us or the stories that we brought with us, how we interpret them differently. And I think the assignment was to write these stories from that kind of a perspective, if that makes sense. Does everybody kind of get that? That was what you were. Those were the guidelines, sort of. Because
Mhm.
it's more than just a theme. It's a lot more than that. She wanted to really showcase a lot more than just your typical theme for an anthology. Really like delve
Yeah,
into our backgrounds.
I agree, but I do want to say for anyone listening who doesn't know what this anthology is, it's the Silk and Sinew anthology, edited by Kristy Park Kulski. It's sort of an anthology of, like Reina said, Asian diaspora and the evolution. But I did want to just sort of shout out the name if anyone is trying to run like a quick Google search in the background.
And when does it premiere?
It's next May?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
yeah, it's
that's
in
the
May.
secret I was told.
Okay.
I'm
Oh,
pretty
okay.
sure. I'm pretty sure. Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. And I love, Reina, as you mentioned, right? Like, what is your different interpretation of maybe a story that has been told that maybe is well known to a lot of people? What did you take from that story or that monster or that character? That's so cool. Oh, how fun.
I'm trying to think of one. Um,
There's a lot from the list that Kristy
yeah.
provided. I was like, oh man, this is a wealth of fun.
Oh,
Of fun.
oh yeah. Are you okay? You're asking about our specific story in the anthology that we wrote. Mine, I went off of a Thai myth character, the Lady of the Woods, kind of a thing, and so I wanted to use a Thai, basically myself. I wanted to use a Thai immigrant who's from the United States who, and Thailand has this reputation, people go there for certain things. And, sometimes it's vacation and food, and sometimes it's for other things. I won't get into that. But I wanted
Yeah.
to sort of play on that where these people wanted to go there to get footage of a Thai temple that was abandoned and that they had closed it down because bad things were happening there. And so my character, they wanted to bring her as a guide, these white characters, in the United States. She tried to be in their group. They were like paranormal investigators. And so they wanted her to come along to try and translate, even though, she hardly knows any Thai, grew up here, whatever. And so she goes there, and then as she goes there, things happen, and somehow she ends up, I don't want to give it away, but
I know.
but she she realizes she is reacquainted with her culture and finds that she belonged there.
Mm,
That she had lost all those things. She had lost her story when she immigrated, or when her family immigrated, and so she's now there. And at the end of the story, I left it a little bit ambiguous, where is you don't really know if she's happy with the choice or
mm,
not, but that's sort of how things turned out. And that's all
mm.
I'm going to say. I don't want to.
It
Lots
sounds
of
so
cool
good.
stuff happens. Yeah, lots of cool stuff happens in between. But that's
It
the gist
really
of it.
does.
Yeah.
Oh, how exciting. Oh, that sounds cool. And I love that you left it up to the reader to decide. So that's so good. I'm so excited to read it. Kanishk, Audrey, or Sung, do you want to give a little sneak peek into what you created and or what went into it?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about my story. My story is about, let's see, broad themes would be like colonialism, capitalism, eels, lots of eels. It's called Jar of Eels.
Yes.
So it's mainly about sort of the story of a small fishing village that tries to sell whatever they're producing, and the knock-on effects that happen as they realize that they're sort of overfishing the area around
Mm,
them. I would say that there's quite a few references to other stories. Probably people have told me that it's a little bit similar to Innsmouth, the Lovecraftian story. So there are a few references to that, I suppose, perhaps unwittingly. But this is not based on any cultural myth that I know of. Eels are not really a part of South Asian mythology. We have
yeah.
water snakes, which we call nagas,
Yes.
um, but
Which
we
we'll be
don't,
talking about.
which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. I don't want to jump ahead, but we don't really have eels as a part of our myth, at least in Hindu culture and like Indian mythology as much. They're a popular food. They're a popular food in like coastal villages. Um, and I know that eel curry is like delicious. If you guys haven't had the opportunity to try it, it's really, really tasty. But eels don't play this big part in our mythology. And I thought that was interesting because typically when something is a big part of your life, historically it tends to be a big part of your mythology. Common foods, common birds that you see, those tend to form part of like mythological and story traditions because humans are basically storytellers. So when you see an eagle land every single day for a certain point of time, you start to mythologize it, and you start to sort of like spin narratives around it and like why it's doing a certain thing. Um, so I thought that it was very interesting that there's this big blind spot where like we eat eels.
Mhm.
They form part of a staple diet and even a delicacy in some places, and yet there aren't many traditions and tales about it. And so I kind of set out to repair that almost a little bit, which is again egotistical to say, right? Like I'm going to repair a hole in this thousands of years old tradition of storytelling. But in a way it's almost fitting, because like that's what stories do, that's what storytellers do, is we add to existing sort of like corpuses of tales. So yeah, it's not really part of an existing thing, it's kind of its own new thing, but inspired by the things that people do and eat.
Yes. And also the things that you're like, why is this so prominent? Why? Or is not so prominent. I love that. I think that's fantastic. That sounds like it's going to be a great story. And yes, we will be obviously exploring the Naga a little bit later. So very cool. Very cool. How about you, Sung?
Let's see. I'm excited to hear more about the eel canon of works that develops after this.
I know you sprung it, Kanishka. It's going to start now.
Oh yeah,
Um,
eel punk.
Yes, that's going to be the next episode of the Floaties for Krakens podcast, like Eels for Krakens or something.
So my story is a gothic family drama about a Korean American family, and the wife in the family learns that her husband has another family in Korea that he never told her about, and his daughter from this other marriage ends up coming to stay with them because her mother is getting remarried. And there's something kind of weird about this girl who shows up to stay with them. I wanted to like explore the situation of like your past coming back to haunt you and being like confronted with maybe like unresolved issues from your country of origin. So
Ooh, I love that. What a beautiful little metaphor. Oh, that's so cool. That's so exciting.
Also,
I'm
like, children are such a big part of horror, you
yeah.
know? Like orphans and children and like children from previous marriages are just
Mhm.
like so traditionally like part of horror movies, and they always freak me out. Like it's just such a
Yeah.
big trope of the genre.
Mhm.
You're so right. There's that, I don't know, feeling of the unknown of how did you come to be?
Mhm.
Which, is heartbreaking, of course, at its core, but I don't know, there's an interesting horror allure to those characters specifically. Oh, that's awesome. What a great story. That sounds like it's going to be a great read. Definitely. And Audrey, how about yourself?
Yes. My story is called Mother's Daughter. And so I wanted to explore a lot about like what your immigrant parents give up for you when you move to a new place. And then also just a lot about like mother daughter and then like sister relationships. It's centered on this family of three witches. So we have a mother and two sisters. I don't think witches really appear much in Chinese mythology, but
Yeah.
I think, Rana, please correct me if I'm wrong about anything.
you're, you're perfect.
I think most magic in Chinese mythology is more centered around like being like a liaison between like humans and like gods or like ancestors. But for my story, I wanted to explore more of like a contractual based magic system. Like, what if it was like physically like what your parents were giving up for you and what you were trying to give back? So the horror in mind comes from like their magic system works by like you physically give up like parts of your body for like acts of magic or like to get things back.
Oh, and that lineage aspect. Oh, that's so fascinating. That's so cool. Oh, what a cool story. I love this. I get so excited. I'm so excited to read it. And I also, one of my favorite things to explore in the world of folklore um, is how generational trauma is folklore too, right? Because it's unintentionally passed down to you, whether you like it or not. And I kind of like that idea of this contractual obligation. That's so fast. Oh, I love it. Oh, what great stories. You all are so cool. This is going to be a great read. And I'm so excited. Congratulations on it, by the way. But I think this is going to be so much fun to read in May. So yeah, we'll put all that information in this description. And obviously, throughout this episode, the monsters that we're exploring, right? Some of them you may see in some of these stories, and some of them you may not. But that's what's so exciting. But yeah, just so you know, keep an eye on that story. It's going to be great. Wonderful. Well, I have a very hard question for each of you. And let's start with Sung. Sung, in your words, what do you believe is a monster?
I think it's something abject that takes on the fear in a society. I was like looking up definitions of monster trying to like answer this question, and a lot of them talk about like shape. But I think like monsters can be any shape, and it's more like their relationship to things like for vampires it's like blood, or and it kind of like it has to be something that gets at like a deep-seated like cultural fear or societal fear.
There is definitely that aspect of fear in that character. Yeah. Great definition, absolutely. How about you, Audrey?
I think similarly, maybe like something that is feared because it's different or doesn't fit in. I feel like, I don't know, I feel like people are scared of things that aren't like themselves, or just like othering. I think that's how I define a monster.
Yes, absolutely. Those otherized creatures that are somehow banned from society for some reason. Yes, that otherness. Definitely. Raina, how about yourself? What do you
A
think?
lot the same. I think it can be like what we fear can be the monster, all, our fears or other people's fears of what, they fear is the monster. And also, monsters, I think, are something that we or our characters can create with our fears, or
Yes.
for our want of revenge, or that kind of monster. It can be like a metaphor for that.
Yes, they are those projections, right, of things we don't understand, or just these strong feelings, right? Like it's almost like they give us something to be mad at. They give us something to feel at, if that makes sense. That's absolutely right.
Or come
Definitely.
together, or come
Or come
together
together.
and try and resolve or destroy, or what have you.
Absolutely. Or befriend. Yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. How about you, Kanishk? What do you think is a monster?
I think that I agree with what everyone else has said, but I kind of want to turn the question back and sort of ask, like, well, what isn't a monster, right? Like, basically, horror seems to have evolved a lot to the point where um, I think otherness is a very classic kind of monster and obviously still exists a lot. But we also get a lot of like new horror that is about the twisting and the strangeness of the familiar, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of stuff about um, body snatching. You get a lot of stuff about like someone that you already know really well having gone through a transformation and becoming something unique and terrifying. I've written stories about that exact concept before. And even like the mundane stuff can be a monster, right? So like Ligotti, who's a very famous American horror fiction author, he wrote a story about a vampiric pair of pants, mainly as a way of showing that like anything can be scary. Um, so I think that horror is in many ways sort of this very all-encompassing definition, because almost any individual thing can become a monster or can become scary. Obviously, it's a reflection of what people in general find terrifying at any given moment in time, but it's very hard, I think, to pinpoint like what exactly is a monster versus what is not, because like that feels arbitrary in some ways.
Absolutely. Welcome to the show. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, everybody. Yes, exactly. I love that. And I think that's what almost makes it more terrifying at times, right? You never know what could be. Um, but also beautiful in a way, because, for many cultures or just many individuals, right? Like monsters are forms of friends. Monsters are yourself, right? You see yourself reflected in those roles at times, and sometimes that's empowering, and sometimes that's reclaiming that term. But yeah, absolutely. There's no right way, I think, to define it, which is a right way in and of itself.
Mhm.
It's everything and it's nothing, and it's all things and it's some things, and that's what's so cool about monstrosity. Definitely, definitely. Great. Well, we're going to go down the line talking about some very iconic monsters for each of you and how they've played massive, parts in your story, whether that's like through your own cultural identity, right? Or your identity as a human, or hey, maybe you just think they're cool. I'm excited to pick your brain on each of these monsters. And we're going to start with Sung. So Sung, please, can you tell us what a kumiho is?
Okay, Gumiho is like a shape-shifting fox spirit. It literally means nine-tailed fox, and there are examples of it in China, Japan, and Vietnam. So in China, you have the Hulijing, and in Japan, I think it's called Kitsune. And they're shapeshifters, but they're often described as like beautiful women or as foxes, and they like to eat liver.
Yes. And if you can remember, where did you first hear of a kumiho in your life?
So I guess it wasn't Kumiho specifically, but probably Pokemon and Digimon.
Yes,
Naruto.
Ninetales.
Not the Nine-Tailed Fox
Pokemon
in
has
Naruto.
Ninetales, and Digimon has Cubimon, and I owned one of those when I was a kid. I owned one of those like Pokedex books that had descriptions, and I remember the Ninetales one said that if you touch one of its tails, you'll be cursed for 1,000 years. I loved
Iconic.
that. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I think that's what's so cool about cartoons like Pokemon and anime and things is just how many rich cultural traditions are in a lot of these characters, right? And then like other Pokemon can just be like, that's just Ditto, you know what I mean? Nothing
It's a
too
blob.
crazy about that blob over there. But this Ninetale spirit, right? That's so awesome. And can you describe to me kind of what do they look like for somebody that maybe has never seen one before or heard of one before? Or are there different versions of what they may look like or appear as?
Yeah, so like a lot of times they're incredibly beautiful, but their beauty, like if they're a human, has like some kind of like foxy element to it. So like there'll be like tells that they're not entirely human. They can have like tails up to 9. So like
Yeah.
I think they like gain tails like as they go. And a lot of times they're carrying like beads or they have some kind of like pearl or something.
Oh my gosh. And who do they appear to? Do you know? Or like who can see them? Or is there a rhyme or reason for them?
I think a lot of times they're kind of like tricksters and they show up to kind of hapless guys
Yeah.
and like tricking them. But sometimes they just show up and just kind of like screw your life up randomly. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
I mean, and tricksters are just a whole other fun genre of monstrosity. I mean, they are fun. Like, you can learn so much from a trickster monster. They're terrifying, but in a lot of ways, too, I think the beautiful thing about tricksters is they almost unintentionally or intentionally fight for something. There is a group of people or society or something that they are representing and fighting for, right? And we'll definitely get into that exploration of sexuality and female identity and identity in general. So we're definitely going to get there. But I'm interested, Sung. Do you know if there is, and I'm sure it's hard, right? There's probably not one, but maybe an origin story or a legend of the Kumiho at all?
Okay, so there's many stories and they're like spread across like a number of different countries. Um I would say one of my favorite ones, the Korean ones, is the story of the Fox sister. And it's like this guy who's been praying for a daughter and he already has these sons. And the daughter is born and she starts killing like their cows. And the
Oh
dad
my
doesn't
gosh.
believe the sons. The sons are telling him, like, our sister's killing the cows. And he's like, I don't believe you. Like, get out. You know, you can't talk about your sister like that.
How dare
So
you?
then um the sons leave. They meet this Buddhist monk who gives them these like potions, and he's like, use these against the spirit. They come back. She's killed their parents. She feeds them a delicious meal, which they're not entirely sure how because the house is like a wreck. And yeah, it turns
I have
out
a feeling I know
she's
how.
yeah.
I think
She's a fox spirit. and she wants to eat them. So like they throw the potions at her, and eventually she like bursts into flames. But
Wow.
one of my favorite things about the story is there's like not really a moral. Like it's like a lot of Korean stories, it's like the parent is not the one in the wrong, you know. But here, obviously, like the dad's not believing the sons, so like something's wrong there. And then
Yeah.
like he's like, she just kind of like eats them. It's like it's really good. Like
It's iconic. It's
Yeah.
great.
To be fair, to be fair to the dad, okay, if I had like 4 kids and one of them came up to me and said, "Hey, our sister is transforming into like a beast in the middle of the night and killing cows," I would also be like, "You are clearly on substances. Like, just make some sense. What are you talking about? Get out!" Right?
I'd be like, guys, what did you do to her? Right? Like, what did you do to make her so mad? Huh? Maybe you just stop doing that. Okay, it's your fault.
Maybe you should stop bullying your sister.
Yeah, how about that? Okay, stop calling her a cow. Yeah, so I
Women
think
can't
that's
do anything. God.
Oh, I love it. I love this air of mystery. I love also this kind of playing with the transformation of innocence too. I think there's a lot of explanation there, and we're definitely going to dig into that, but I do want to talk to everybody a little bit about who their monster is, and then we're going to really break down these metaphors. So, perfect. Let's jump over to Audrey. Now, Audrey, do you mind telling us a little bit about what a witch is? And I know, right, you mentioned like witches are not necessarily traditionally prominent, at least the Western view of a witch, right? In the world of Asian mythology. But I'm curious, what do you think a witch is?
Yes. The other thing is there are already so many different like depictions of witches. So I guess
Yeah.
like at the base form, a person who has access to like magic powers. And then yeah, I think in like Western depictions, at least like thinking about like fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel, like you often have like this image of like an old woman who's like maybe trying to trick you, has probably some very evil tales about her. But then I don't know, I think like in my first exposure to like witches outside of like those fairy tales, it would be like Harry Potter or like shows like Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
Yeah.
Just like normal people that just have power and can be used for good or bad, but doesn't have to be bad necessarily.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's fantastic. And I think we were kind of talking about this song, I think before actually we started recording. We were talking about kind of the depictions of older females in the world of horror, right? And I think it's interesting that in a lot of at least Western renditions of the witch, right, there is that emphasis of, oh, she's old and she's crazy, but she's magic as heck, so don't mess with her, right? Which is, I think, an interesting description and arguably hurtful, right? But yet they're the most powerful beings ever, right? In a lot of these stories. Oh, that's a great description. What you kind of mentioned this a little bit, Audrey. What do witches tend to look like? Is there one way they look? Is there diverse ways that they can present themselves?
You know, I think as Halloween approaches, we might see some people covered in like green body paint, like
Yeah.
minty hat, cloak. But yeah, in other depictions, I think they look more just like ordinary humans. In my story, at least, I chose to go for just like they fit in with like the rest of the town, just look like humans.
Which is deceptive, which is scary, right? Like, oh my goodness, you couldn't even tell that there was a witch living there. Ooh, I love that. That's great. Do you
Can I ask a
know?
follow up?
Oh yes, go for it, Kanishk, please.
Does China, so for example, I know India and Africa both have sort of like a tradition and a culture around like having a cursed child or a touched child, like children who are born somehow different, and so they're either like worshipped or reviled, and there's like various things about that, and one of those I'll talk about later. But does China have a tradition of something like that could tie into witches, like of children who are born different or strange, and therefore there's like myths around that. Obviously for Audrey, but also Reina, you mentioned that you're Thai Chinese, so that too, for you too.
From my understanding, I feel like that might tie in more with like Yolgwe, which I think translates maybe more closely to like demons. I don't know why there's such like this distinction, but I was actually talking to my parents yesterday before this, make sure I wasn't spreading misinformation. Um, they told me that oftentimes you don't even really see like super like evil woman like in Chinese mythology. There are definitely some examples in like Journey to the West, but for the most part, I think there aren't even like many like I guess like human adjacent creatures that do ill will. It's more like more explicitly like demons or like ghosts that look monstrous. That was interesting.
Great question. Absolutely. And Kanishk, I know you mentioned you asked Reina a similar question, but Reina, it might have been booted out right in between. Kanishk, do you mind asking your question again?
Oh yeah, I was asking about like the myth of like cursed children or touched children sort of tying into witches, because I know that that happens a little bit in some traditions where like witchy powers are like part of being born different. And so I was wondering if there was any other cultural artifacts like that.
Oh, well, in Thailand, yeah, they do have like I wouldn't say they do have uh witches or mediums, especially in the like the smaller villages and like people who live in the city, they it's just like if you think of like the United States as like the people in the rural South, who were the gothic, the Bell Witch stories, those kinds of
Oh
things. It's
yeah.
sort of like that,
Yeah.
where you get, people in the big cities who they think of the people in the villages as rural and kind of the rednecks of Asian stuff, and so they do have those stories, and they have stories of people coming from the cities to go see that witch doctor. I mean, it's been in like movies, even like Asian movies. Thailand is known for that. The Eye, for example, the original, the woman is Japanese who gets the eye from a girl in Thailand whose mother was a witch that people would go to. And so, yeah, definitely in Thai culture, there is that. And there's also, uh, I wouldn't know specifically about children, except that if you're a woman and you're pregnant and you die, that you are very powerful, and it's the strongest Thai ghost is a woman who was died in pregnancy, and because you she was carrying two spirits, because she has the
Mm-hmm.
power of two, and that's something that I like to go back to. It's a tough one because the Thai people, they believe this is a as a true story. It's not to them. It's not a ghost story. So
Mm-hmm.
when I'm writing, and my mom always tells me I have to be very respectful, because, uh, like, I try not to name names in the story, even though if you're Thai, you're gonna know because this is famous, and it's supposedly a real character. And even now, my mom said recently that bad things were happening in the village where this gal had supposedly lived, and so they like went and burned the house down, the people that lived in that area, because other people would go and bring things. Thailand's like back and forth where they like to bring offerings. If you ever see like pictures and tourist things, you'll see ribbons hanging from trees and whatnot, and that those are like offerings. You'll see like fruit drinks and all kinds of food laid out, and that's usually to celebrate or honor someone, but it can also be bad because then the people think that sometimes acknowledging these things will make them manifest things. So,
Hmm.
Yeah.
but yes, they do have those Kanishk in Thailand for sure.
How fascinating. How fascinating. And I love that you said Reina too, right? Like this isn't for many people, right? Like these stories or these monsters, these characters, right? They're real. They're not right. They're not like these are their lives that they're dealing with these actual things, right? And so it's interesting to see how those interplay. Absolutely, absolutely. Oh, I love it. I love learning about this stuff. Well, Audrey, what inspired you to use the character of the witch? I know you kind of touched on it a little bit when we asked about like a little summary of your story, but why did you feel like that was a wonderful kind of vessel of a character, right, to tell this story?
So I think alongside like having that access to like a contractual based magic system,
Right.
I was also interested in like witches. I feel like being for the most part like pretty gendered, or like they're always women. And then I wanted to focus a lot on like mothers specifically, and how they're like in that like caretaking role often, and how I think that like puts a lot of toll on a person.
Yeah.
But then also I think, I don't know, I think there's something special about mother and daughter relationships, um,
Yeah.
that can be a little like twisted, if you move it the right way. That was another.
Definitely. Definitely. Oh, great. Okay, great. I have a question in my pocket for you and Sung in the same vein. But before we get there, I'm gonna jump over to Kanish. Now, Kanish, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but what is a naga, right? What is a water snake?
So in Indian mythology, Nagas are basically half serpent, half people. They can take the form of a full serpent. I was first introduced to the Naga as part of the myth of Krishna, who is a
Mm.
divine avatar of one of the three sort of main gods in Hindu religion, Vishnu. Um, it's hard to explain Indian mythology because all of it is so interconnected that it becomes very difficult to sort of go into like specific detail. But the summary of it is that Krishna was a goat herder and basically a divine child in a village, and he found a Naga terrorizing the village. This big Naga water snake called Kalia, and so Kalia is has multiple heads. It's very reminiscent of like a Greek Hydra in that
Yeah.
sense. And so, in order to vanquish the Naga, the water snake, Krishna dances on its head and forces it to like release all of its poison so that it can no longer pollute the water and like cause harm to the village.
Mm.
That's a very sort of summarized version of this story. And as with so many sort of like oral myths and cultural traditions, there are over 1.5 billion people in India, and so there are over 1.5 billion retellings of the story. Um,
Yeah.
so I've made a lot of people very angry by telling it in this way, but that is the version that I heard when I was a child.
Yeah.
So that was my first exposure to Nagas. What's important to know is that Nagas are not always or even often evil. This is the
Mm.
most famous story about the Naga that I heard, but typically Nagas are divine. So they are part of the pantheon of gods. They reside in like the heavenly courts. They are used for various purposes. One of them is used to actually create sort of the ocean of milk, which is one of the
Mm.
seven oceans that form part of like the firmament of the world. And so, like, there's a bunch of like really interesting cosmological myths surrounding them. But that's for Nagas.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mentioned earlier, eels have very little to no real trace in our cultural myth and tradition, which I thought was interesting because Nagas are very similar to eels. Like they, in my mind at least, they occupy what would be a similar sort of storytelling niche. They're like water reptiles, not water snakes, but like water reptiles. They should sort
Yeah.
of have like a similar body of work, but they don't. And I was kind of like, why is that? And I couldn't find a great reason, so I started to write about them.
That's so fantastic. I love it. I think that's great. And I don't know. I mean, I've seen, every culture is very different. And I've seen I can't remember the specific culture, but I remember reading a story about how it is like super against all tradition to consume eel, because they are always the guardians of the underworld. They are the ones that take whoever has passed on right into that other world, right? So I don't mess with them. I don't talk about them. I don't deal with them, right? And then I've heard other cultures, right, that are like they are our everything, right? Like we love them, we cherish them, anything surrounding, right, their narrative. And so I think
Mhm.
it's so interesting that you're challenging all of this and exploring it and breaking it down in your story. You're asking questions, which is fantastic, you know. And can you explain? I know you touched on it a little bit, Kanishk, but what, like, if a naga was to appear in front of you, right? What would you see? What would it look like?
I think that what you would see is basically the bottom half of a snake and the top half of a person, which is very similar to, again, the Western conception of like a mermaid almost.
Gotcha.
Um, but I think that the thing is that most Nagas, I believe, can appear fully as snakes or fully as people as well. Like some
Mm.
mentioned, there are probably some tails. But the few images I've seen of them, they're typically like top half human, bottom half snake, bottom half reptile.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you would see. Is very similar to a mermaid. Um, Kalia from the myth, like I said, had multiple heads, and so there's this very famous image of Krishna dancing on like the seven snake heads. And so in that image, the naga is just one snake that splits into seven heads, or eight heads, I think, like very similar to the Greek Hydra. So
Mm.
the thing that really fascinates me is that so many of these myths seem to have overlaps from different places, and obviously there were a lot of trade routes and there was a lot of like cultural overlap between Greece and India.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of trade. There was like a big war on the border of India and Greece a long time ago. And so it makes
Yes.
sense that our myths and traditions have some overlap and there was probably some cultural exchange.
Hmm.
But it's always just fascinating to sort of like see something in one culture and then be like, oh, there's like almost like a one is to one or a very similar interpretation in a different culture entirely that you wouldn't have
Ah.
expected. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so interesting. It's interesting to see too how these characters morph depending on what cultures your history has crossed paths with, as you
Mhm.
mentioned too. And it's great. It makes for a fascinating story. What do you think, Kanishk, is the appeal? Because obviously there are many characters across cultures, right, where animal and human kind of combine, right? Why do you think that is so often used to tell a story, or seen as monstrous, right? When a human and an animal become one.
I want to open this up to everybody, but my personal thought process here is that animals formed a really large part of human culture for a very long time, right?
Yeah.
Like most human civilizations went from like hunter gatherers to like agrarian civilization to then like starting to become like larger and more urban civilizations broadly. And
Yeah.
so I think that as part of that tradition, um, you start to slowly realize how much of your daily bread is reliant on nature, on animals either working with you or like on hunting animals for meat and food and game. And so I think that because they're so central to like being a part of your life, you start to form myths and traditions around them.
Hmm.
um there's also a lot of like stories about unholy couplings and like bestiality and stuff in
Sure,
various
sure.
myths and traditions, about how like when people lay with beasts like that can cause all sorts of awful things to happen. And so I think that's part of like the natural aversion and disgust that humans have towards like that kind of relationship with animals. um, and so I think that we form traditions and myths around the things that we see and rely on and that like are part of your every single day. And
Yeah.
nature and animals have been part of humans like livelihood for so many hundreds of thousands of years that like obviously we naturally form like these long-standing myths about them. But
Yes.
that's just one interpretation, and I would love to know if everyone else here has like a different idea.
Great idea, though. Great interpretation. If I could interject too, I think there's also this, like if we think of our generic, right, Western version of a werewolf, for example, right, like some sort of shape shifting creature. I think for some reason, a lot of people think, um, animals are so far removed. And some, at least the Western and a lot of Western views. I'm not saying everybody, but they're so far removed from human. They could never be the same thing. And so when people think of like a werewolf, for example, they think of absolute loss of control, They
Mhm.
think I do not have any control in who I am and how I present and how I go about this world. And it's losing that sense, right? And I think that's what's so beautiful about the Naga, for example, right? Or talking about other explorations across cultures that maybe aren't necessarily westernized. There's such power and there's such fascination, and they've been respected so much, for such a long time, right? That there's not just loss of control, which can happen with shapeshifting, sure, but power. And bringing in this idea of power and superhuman ability. Humans like don't even matter at that point, right? It's like, no, but look at this beautiful creature. So I think that's interesting to see how different people decide what a monster is. Again, it's going into that definition thing again of who gets the privilege to call who a monster. So
Yeah.
definitely.
Actually, what you brought up is really interesting because Indian myth in general doesn't think of like the blending of beast and human as like a negative for the most part.
Yeah.
There are probably examples where it is a negative, but we have a half bird, half man called Garuda, who is like a semi divine being. He plays like a big part in many stories. He's sort of like revered in various parts of India. Ganesha has the head of an elephant and the body of a human because of his origin story.
Yeah.
And so, like, again, in India, animals are revered to a large degree. And so, for us, animals represent certain, like, physical qualities or, like, spiritual qualities. And so, the melding of the two is often like a divine thing. It's not necessarily unholy or bad. And so, the Naga is not, again, typically considered to be like a sacrilegious thing or a negative thing. It is a
Right.
divine creature. It's not really like what I would call a monster.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love it. Oh, I absolutely love it. That's
To
amazing.
take from Kanish for a moment, the Thailand took the Ramayana, the story of India, and they made their version of it. So on a lot of Thai temples but they just picked and chose which ones they wanted. Like the Garuda, I know is on many temples. The Naga is definitely, but usually the Naga is seen as a dragon snake more so than I haven't seen in Thai culture the half human version of that, but they're definitely the Garuda, the bird man uh, images and symbolism on a lot of the temples. But I think part of that was like from trade and migration, also the stories and the food
Yes.
as well.
Yes. Yes. Oh, a great point. Great point, Reina. Absolutely. And I know in respect of time, we're going to keep going. But speaking of animals, Reina, can you please tell us who Godzilla is?
Godzilla for me now, let's go back. I came to the United States in the 70s or very early 70s. I was very young, and at the time, there really wasn't a lot as far as Asian culture. Where I grew up and lived was in Sacramento, California, and there it was very limited to what we were able to watch. And one of the first things when I was really young was Godzilla. And it was when my aunt came to visit us, and she had just come from Thailand, and she would stay up late at night and watch movies because we weren't allowed to watch anything scary. And so
Mhm.
I snuck out and I watched Godzilla, and I was fascinated because here was a whole movie with Asian people in it. It was great. And
Yes.
it was just great for me to see. So even though I was scared, I kept watching it, and so for me, Godzilla, I just thought it was so cool because I just thought, oh, here is this monster and he's Asian and he's kicking butt, on all these people. And so that really has stayed with me all this time. So I have like this huge fondness for anything Godzilla. And and then I was thinking also that for me, he represented all of the unknown things. I
Mm.
felt like because there was so little um, Asian influence where I was, that it was something that I had, even though, I'm Thai and Godzilla's Japanese. It was just um something Asian in general that, I had and I could take with me. I mean, like now it's like, I wish I was my kids who grew up, with the Pokemon, and for when at the time when I grew up, it was, wasn't so great. It was, they were still getting like the last waves of people from Vietnam, and a lot of times I would get put in with those kids, and I would have to go like test my reading and my writing with kids who had just, migrated in from after the war. So it was really interesting growing up then, and then eventually, like I want to say after maybe a couple of years, when I was maybe 6 or 7, they started showing Ultraman. And
Oh my
if
gosh.
if you kids want to, go back retro, that's like way back in the day. That was like the stuff that I got to watch, and it was cool because there were Asian people on, on it. So for me, it was a lot harder, I think, because it just wasn't out there. So my heroes and things were always like movies or shows on the weekends that they would show. So like kung fu movies were really popular, and so I loved all of
Yes.
those,
Yes.
and then and the Journey to the West, the old movies that they would show, so that was like a real big deal for me. And we all fell in love with the Monkey King. I mean, if you were young, and it's like, because he was like such a, prankster and everything. So I remember now in my, like, when I write stories now, it's like, because even then I always wanted the Monkey King to like be a woman, to be
Yes.
a girl and kick butt. So I try and write my character, I have like, when I write characters, I try and uh make them with the personality of the Monkey King. Like I'll take the Nine Fox, the Hoolie Jane. I did in a story recently who's like, she's a detective, but she's like, the Monkey King, where, she's is a jokester and is funny and kicks butt. So
Yes. Oh, I love that. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's either in the works or about to come out. Isn't there a new Journey to the West or a Monkey King video game coming out soon? And it looks beautiful. It looks so cool. And like I'll have to find that and I'll put it in the description and I'll tell you
I
all
think it's
about it.
Black Myth, right? Wukong. Yeah,
Yes. Yes,
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
so.
I think it's out.
Is it out? Gosh,
Yes.
it looks cool. It looks really cool with a lot of beautiful renditions of these. I love when people get creative, just like you all as authors. I love when people take their own interpretations to the next level. And I love seeing that in video games with animators, right? How are you going to make these guys look? How are you going to make them talk and act? And what is the score, right? I think it's beautiful, Reina, that you found your identity represented right in these stories, right? And I just think that I can visualize it. I see you staying up late, right, and watching movies like Godzilla, right, and sharing that, and that is so, it hits so deep. It hits right in the heart of why these stories are so important, right? And I think people are very quick um to kind of write off whether it's horror or sci-fi or fantasy, right, escapism genres, and they're so easy to be like, those are silly, or those are, using it as a derogatory term, those are childlike, right, or those, aren't important. I get so pissed because yes, they are. And what of it being childlike, right? Children are some of the most smart, like one of the smartest people I've ever met, right? I've learned so many beautiful things from children, and touching on those very pure forms, right, of emotion and family or monsters or what have you, right, is so important. And I think for many cultures, right, a lot of the time the first time they see themselves represented on the big screen or in any platforms of that nature are in movies like Godzilla,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's beautiful, Raina. I love that you had that memory. That's such a beautiful memory to have. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Well, okay. I know we're running low on time, and I don't want to make you guys have to stay here any longer than you have to, but I have a couple more questions before we finish. Um, each of you kind of touched on this in your initial descriptions of these monsters, and anybody can go first again. But I'm curious whether it's Godzilla, right, the Naga, right, Miho, the witch, right? Have you all seen any parallels, right, to maybe your own lives, right, or your own identities, right? Or how have you explored that dichotomy with your monster and maybe with yourself as well? It's a layered question, I know.
I can start with that one since we were just talking about Godzilla. I feel like I've evolved with Godzilla. If you think of the
Yes.
Godzilla movies, early on it was about the rage, really. Here he was, coming back. He was angry that they had woken him up, that they woke him up, and he was just out to
Yes.
destroy. And when I was younger, I felt that anger and that rage because of, you know, uh, prejudice and racism, when I was
Mm-hmm.
growing up in school and whatnot. And
Mm-hmm.
so I felt at the time I could totally relate to Godzilla, and he was with me. He was like what I had in my back pocket, when I got upset or angry. And as I grew older and um, moved around a little bit more and got to see more of my culture represented in places, I felt like the next movie that came out where now Godzilla is like the people who are they're working to save him, and then there's baby Godzilla where where you're rooting for Godzilla because Ghidorah is the bad one now. It's
Right. Right.
so I feel like that, and I feel like I grew as Godzilla grew and became more compassionate instead of just a monster out for revenge, kind of, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Oh, totally. That's beautiful. And that's what's so cool about Godzilla is he fights for, I don't know. You'd always see it that way. He fights for the little guy. He fights, he tries to destroy what's wrong. And of course there's many different renditions, right? And
Yeah,
a lot of people depict Godzilla as this version of an anti-hero, right? Because he still destroys things. But it's complicated because he's fighting the bad, right? And I just think it's so beautiful that you can see yourself in that, right? And in that growth and in that power, right? Like that's so beautiful. That's great.
Um, I can go next.
Go for it.
I think as a trans person, I identify with the fox's like shape shifting
Yeah.
and the kind of like dangerous gendered energy that it's got going on. And I think there's an element in some of the fox stories about like uncontrolled sexuality that's like
Mm,
kind of queer. Um, so I can
yeah.
relate to that. There's like this like appetite that this creature has that is like considered, I don't know, dangerous or wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so I find it so beautiful. And it's complicated, it's layered, it's mixed. When queer explorations and queer representations are found in quote unquote monstrous characters, right? Because it's like, no, but like they're depicting what it feels like so brilliantly. But then it's so heartbreaking when it's like what happens to the monster at the end of the story, right? Or they're seen as, again, as we mentioned earlier, these ostracized beings. But I think it's beautiful, right? That you see, I don't know, like as you mentioned, right, the nine-tailed fox spirit, right, almost like breaks itself into these nine different versions, right? And there's so many versions of like, how am I supposed to be a woman, or how am I supposed to find myself, like in all of these different interpretations. But yet she's so freaking powerful. She could do whatever the hell she wants to do, and she's so badass and like just iconic, like in every sense of the term, right? And I think it's beautiful song that like I don't know, and you can see yourself in that. Like that's powerful. That's reclamation, I think, in its purest form, you know. But at the same time, I'm so sorry that like you know have to be felt like this exploration of sexuality is so monstrous in the bad way. You know what I mean? Because it's not. It's not by any means. It's power. It's power at its purest form, you know? Beautiful. Audrey or Kanish?
I can go next. I think, yeah, with like witches, I have like a similar gendered like connection there. I think it's unfair that in like I guess like more historical Western depictions, witches are like old women who are like shafted into like being evil or bad. Um, it's also really interesting that with that, like evilness comes with all of this power.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I think moving on to like how we have like a lot more varied depictions of witches, they're appealing to me because you're able to like access that power and you're no longer like delineated into like having to use it for like bad. Like it can be good too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Bringing it back to my story, I just think it's very hard to be like a little sister or a big sister or like a daughter or a mother.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think it's cool to think about like what power exists in those dynamics as well and how you can twist it.
Definitely. Like you're absolutely right. Those, you know, it's so heavy. I think carrying those contractual obligations again, right? Like really, like metaphorically and literally, because women have to hold them so forever and so deeply and so heavily, right? And I think along with that though is carrying that pride and carrying that strength that every woman before you carried too, which is so iconic in an awesome witchy way. You know what I mean? And I think you, right, Audrey, in your narrative, I think you're also reclaiming that, right? Like you don't understand. I think you don't you know people don't understand the strength that lies with being called a witch. There's some really cool badassery, I think, in that. So I think it's wonderful. Great answer.
Thank you.
I think that not the Naga specifically, but in my story, the eels are kind of a representation of what it means to be a part of the culture. My story is about sort of like colonialism and how one of the insidious ways in which colonialism works is that it takes a part of your culture and uses that to betray you.
Mm,
And so eels form like a part of the culture for Indian mythology and for the fishing village specifically, that cannot be taken and cannot be turned into a form of betrayal.
mm,
And so to me, I guess like my story is all about trying to find the parts of your culture that are truly authentic, that are truly like not being taken away from you or being robbed by like an external force. I'm not sure that the Naga myth really fits in with that storytelling that I was trying to accomplish there, but yeah, that's kind of where I would go with it.
yes. It does though. I think it does. I think your idea is brilliant. I don't know. I think and I really think your explanation right now of colonialism really hits hard of like using a known form of itself to hurt you.
Hmm.
Oh gosh, you know, and I think it's really nicely illustrated in your story, exploring the water snake, exploring the naga, right? Like it's fascinating. All of your interpretations are so great, and I love that they're challenging these social norms. I think that's amazing. That's incredible. Well, two final questions for each of you. Why do you all think, right, whether it's talking about monsters, writing about monsters, exploring monsters, why do you think monsters are so important?
Because they're to me, monsters are universal, something that everybody knows or has experienced just as a human being.
Yeah.
So monsters, they don't care what your race is. They don't care what religion you believe. You know, the monsters I think of or that I create. They just are on a one track to, destroy or to hurt or whatever. And then the good side of that, like I had said previously, whereas like if you have a monster, all of those things that are there and apparent are pushed aside to defeat the monster or to overcome whatever it is that is caused this problems in a community. Then afterwards who knows what happens, but that's why to me monsters are important, and why I use monsters in a lot of my work is because they don't see color or anything else.
Beautiful answer, Reina.
I think that monsters are often a way of taking like like something in society to an extreme, right? A lot of writing is about that, but I think that monsters in particular are about taking something dark or something unsatisfying about society, pushing the boundary of it up until the point where like it is horrific and it is monstrous. um, I think about like Frankenstein as basically pushing science to the extreme, right? It was all about how the Victorians had some general unsettlement about the fact that science was progressing so fast that man was going to start playing God. So in that sense, I think that monsters are good because they take sometimes an unsaid anxiety, sometimes like a minor issue in society, and they take it to what is like an illogical extreme. They try and put it to the point where like you have to be confronted with it and try to figure out what solutions lie, like Reina said. So I agree with that part of it for sure. But I also said earlier, like, what isn't a monster, right? Anything can be scary, anything can be horrifying. And so we write about monsters because we try to explore to some degree all of the fears that may or may not be like immediately obvious to us, invisible and visible.
Absolutely, definitely. Great answer, Kanishk.
Going off of that, I think that it's really interesting to like explore like what monsters are like born out of certain fears or maybe like desires. Like what Rain was talking about earlier with like Godzilla, I think it's really interesting to want to like assume some of that like monstrous power. I think it's also like very valuable to like explore like where these fears are coming from, if they're rational or not, and also like where desires is coming from as well.
They tell you about yourself. Definitely. Great answer.
I think using the Gumiho as an example, it can help us like understand the arc of society's attitudes towards women. I think in the past like couple decades, we've seen like a lot of reclamation of like with Larissa Lai's Foxes 1000 or Sally Wenmao's Nine Tails. Those are like stories that bring the Gumiho into like an explicitly Asian American, or sorry, Hulijing into an explicitly Asian American context. And like those books kind of like work through this like fear and examine the culture that they come from. So
great answer. Yes, working through that, and putting pen to paper in a metaphorical sense of why is this the way that it is, and fighting against the bad. Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, last question of the interview, and we'll go in order. We'll start with Kanishk. Kanishk, say you're just chilling, right? Say you're relaxing on this beautiful Sunday, right? And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a naga appears right in front of you. What do you think you would do in that situation? What would you say? How would that play out?
I think that if a naga were to appear right in front of me, what's weird is like I don't think that my first thought process would be that it's a naga. I think that I would immediately think that it's a mermaid because again, very similar in body, right? And my mind is kind of poisoned by more Western cultural mythology and imagery.
Yeah.
Maybe the first thing I would feel is like this is a mermaid, and then the second thing I would feel is a deep sense of embarrassment. I mean, God, if a naga appeared in front of me, I think first of all, it's insane because it means that there are so many, like I alluded to earlier, all of Hindu mythology is so interconnected that one piece being real necessitates everything else also existing. So I think I would just be in a certain level of like philosophical and scientific shock because the amount of stuff that has suddenly changed about the world is truly vast. Like there's now an ocean of milk churning somewhere that forms like a major part of like our ecology, you know?
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's kind of where I would be going with that in my head.
I feel like you'd be ready to just start writing immediately.
Yeah,
Got
yeah.
it. Let's go. Well, Audrey, what about you? If a witch were to appear to you at some point, what do you think you would do in that situation?
I do think I'd be a little scared. Maybe it would be bad for me to be scared as a result of all this thing I've been talking about. But I think I'd be very careful not to offend them and would maybe ask for a few tips and tricks if there's anything that's like transferable that I could hold on to for later.
Oh, yeah, asking for advice is probably gonna be so incredible. I would love to hear what they would have to say. I love it. Reina, how about yourself? I mean, it would be pretty obvious, right, if Godzilla was around, I think. But
Yeah,
what do
you
you
and
think?
everyone else.
Yeah, everybody would know.
Yeah.
But how would you, for some reason, right, in this scenario, right, Godzilla sees you, right? What do you think you would do in that situation?
I think I would ask him not to step on my house. I would ask him not to step on my and I would because maybe it's because I'm so much older. I think I would thank him for everything that he's done for me
Yeah.
as far as being in my back pocket or whatever, just having that character that I could feel really good about, even though it was a
No.
monster. I
Oh, that's
made
unfortunate.
him my
Ah,
hero,
Godzilla
so
heard. Wait, say that last sentence again, Reina. I think you bounced in and out.
yeah, I don't know. I was wondering if it was my internet or
I don't know
everyone or
either.
everyone else's, but I keep bouncing in and out, it seems like. But no, I think I would thank him for everything that he's done for me personally.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
beautiful. Give him a big hug on his, I guess, like, that would be, like,
Yes.
not even his whole leg at that
You know,
point, but
and of course you have cute things like this now where, the Godzilla teddy bears and whatnot. So
I was hoping you would mention it at some point, so that's fantastic. That's fantastic. You could show it to him too. Like, look at you. This is what
yes,
you've become.
marketing at its finest.
Yeah, exactly. Well, how about you, Sung? If a Kumiho was to present themselves in front of you, what would you do?
I would probably be like, what have you seen this past 1,000 years?
Yes.
Like, I'm like a history buff kind of, so I'd be like, probably life would be like so different 1,000 years ago.
Oh,
I want to know about it.
definitely. But what a fun conversation that would be. Oh my gosh. We had, I want to say 2 weeks ago, the writer Lee Murray was on the show, and Lee had just written a beautiful story about a fox spirit. And she was like, I would have 9 cups of tea with the fox spirit for every single one of them. And I was like, that's beautiful. And I love it. I love that each of you brought your own sense of I'd acceptance, like immediately, right? Like, of course, there might be fear. Of course, that's a human thing, right? Like, I've never seen you before. I don't know what's going on. But I think that each of you were like, let's pull up a chair, metaphorically or really, right? And let's talk. I think that's quite beautiful and really telling of who each of you are as people. So that's wonderful. Well, goodness, thank you all so freaking much for being on the show. I can't thank each of you enough. And literally, I'm saying this and it's on record, it's on camera. If any of you want to come back to the show for whatever reason, if you're writing something else, if you just want to talk about a monster in your mind or anything of the nature, you always have a free ticket back. So please come back. And I'm just so thankful. Thank you each for doing this. Truly.
Thank you for having us. This was
Yes,
really
thank
fun.
you. It was fun.
It was so much fun. So much
Yeah.
fun. And everybody,
Yeah.
be on the lookout for these amazing people in May. It's
Yeah,
going to be amazing.
I can't wait to read all of your stories now after hearing
Me
you
too.
talk about
Like,
them.
Oh,
Me either.
gosh.
Yeah, Silk and Sinew Anthology. It's
Woo!
out in May.
Yes.
Shout out to Kristy. Yeah,
Yes.
Kristy.
And bad hand
Well,
books. And bad hand books.
yes, bad
And I
handbooks.
have
Yeah.
those. Yes,
Marketing.
of course.
Marketing. Yes,
Marketing,
yes.
yes.
This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and recorded by me, Camille Maria Acosta. A monstrous thank you to Kristy P. Kulski, Raina Mason, Audrey Zhao, Kanishk Dantia, and Sung Kim for such a magical interview. A big thank you to Michael Kosman for producing a stellar episode, and a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And music for the show was written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's show, and happy Halloween! You all truly mean everything to me. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in today's episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. And you can find us on our website and our socials, links in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.